Okay, we are going to actually start with part of Lesson 4, where we were talking about the branches of government and the articles in the Constitution. In the Constitution, there are 7 articles, and we had briefly covered some of the articles, but Article 1 is the legislative branch, Article 2 is the executive branch, and Article 3 talks about the judicial branch. Now, those each have specific powers that are provided for in the Constitution. And as you might remember, as we study the Constitution, you need to become familiar with the various articles, sections, and clauses of the Constitution so that you can actually know where specific clauses and powers are granted. So as we move through this, understand that the Constitution is the source of so many solutions to problems that we have in the world today. Just look at the Constitution and see who has the power to do what. And if you understand these things, then you can actually speak up and be a part of making sure that people stay within what the Constitution provides as their authority and power. And we as people, of course, grant to the Constitution or vest certain rights or powers, I should say, in the government to do certain things. But it's the Constitution contains a lot of what I call fences, that is protection around certain things that they're not to do. And it also limits them so that they don't do more or try to do more than what the Constitution provides. So we have this very awesome power to make laws. And the legislature, composed of the House of Representatives and the Senate, are invested with the authority to make all laws. Well, when we have a lot of rulemaking that has been actually delegated, maybe abdicated is the right word, from the legislature to non-elected, that is appointed bureaucrats that make rules that have the force of law, then we might be looking at some problems because the people elect representatives that go to Congress. They don't elect the bureaucrats. But the bureaucrats have power that the delegation that's been delegated to them by either Congress or sometimes to the executive power. And these are things that we need to make sure that they don't run too far with it, which has probably already happened. So understanding the limitations that are provided for in the Constitution greatly protects the rights of us as individuals. So the power to make laws, the legislature cannot make any law that it chooses. It's controlled by 2 basic things. That is, the constitutional mandates, which are contained in the 7 articles, and also by the amendments to the Constitution, especially those that we call the Bill of Rights, most of which have that phrase in it, Congress shall make no law. Very powerful words, because that does help us control the limits of legislative authority. So some of the things that we can talk about, the requirement for being a legislator in Section 2, that is for the House of Representatives, Section 3 for what the Senate is all about and who can be a senator. We look at different ones in there talking about how a bill moves through Congress. In other words, which house takes up certain bills. We know, for example, that the House of Representatives has the purse strings power. That means that all legislation that deals with acquiring or spending money has to first originate in the House of Representatives. And then, of course, it goes to the Senate, and then oftentimes there are amendments, and then they send it to a reconciliation type committee, and they work on the bill until it's something that can be then presented to the floor on both houses. Now, there used to be a time when all the bills had to be read to the people, read to the members of the House. Now, and you might look back at some old movies, and the senators and congressmen are carrying on this conversation, and then but there's this guy standing up there, and he's just reading this as fast as he can to get through all that bill. They don't even do that anymore. It's not read. And that's a problem, because how can we send people to Congress who have the responsibility to read and approve of the legislation? That's part of what we send them for there to do, and yet it's often just said, well, it got voted out of committee, that's good enough, or my constituents have been polled and I know that they're going to be in favor of it, or there's a special interest group that is going to be helpful to get me elected next time and they're in favor of it, so they just let it go. So as we look at Congress and the executive power, the legislative power, there's quite a few of them. There's 20 different ones that are mentioned in Article 2. Actually, when you look at several of the other articles, though, Congress is mentioned several times. For example, in Article 4, there's 5 different clauses or sections. Congress is mentioned in at least 3 of them. So there's a lot of other things that are contained in the Constitution about the Congress's power. When you make that a comparison, there's we could go through some of the specific ones. For example, Section 8 of the Constitution has, Article 1 has many, many powers. Some of the more important ones, the power to copyrights and patents, that's something we talked about extensively in our first lesson in the Constitution, Patriots Lessons on the Constitution, because that's one of the things that helps us to invent and produce more and grow our country's wealth and prosperity. And then, of course, the power to coin money and to determine its value. That's something that's also vested specifically in Congress. But the problem is that may be delegated to, and has been, to the Federal Reserve, which is neither federal and also has no reserves. So these are problems that we're facing in our limitation, trying to determine the limitation of powers. Some of the things that are included, the power to tax. Originally in the Constitution, there was no such thing as a direct tax, that is, a direct tax on people. The states were responsible for taxing according to the number of people that they had residents in the states, and all of the people were taxed equally. That is, that's what the Constitution provided. We're going to talk about in the amendment section how that was changed. The power to spend, pay their debts, borrow money, regulate commerce. We've had a lot of things in the news about immigration. Well, Congress specifically has the power over naturalization and determining who can become citizens. Also, bankruptcy is governed in there, where it's supposed to be uniform throughout the states. We talked about coin and regulate money's value, standard of weights and measures, laws to punish. One of the biggest punishments that used to exist was the punishment for counterfeiting. Congress determines the punishing of counterfeiters. Okay, of course, there would be so many indictments your head would spin if we looked at what real counterfeiting is going on inside of some of the institutions that control the establishment or the amount of money supply. Establish the postal system, copyright laws, patent laws, federal courts, establish federal courts. So Congress establishes federal courts. This is outside of what's in Article 3, which is the judicial system. And there are certain courts that are created under Article 3. Those are the constitutional courts there. And then there's also other courts created that Congress can create, Article 2 courts. So then Congress also has much power with regard to the country's security. That is, the power to declare war, raise money for financing the armed services, establishing and administering the seat of government, which is Washington, D.C., administering federal lands. And of course, back when the day was when Thomas Jefferson, on behalf of the nation, purchased the Louisiana Purchase, a great amount of new federal land came into existence. And then as the states moved, or new states were added as we moved west, much of that federal land was taken by the federal government kind of as a barter, if you will. If you want to be admitted as a state, then you have to turn over 80% of your land. Well, not a good thing necessarily for states' rights.
Who instituted that one?
I'm not sure that which administration that it happened in. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was right around the same time that Arizona became a state. The next year, 1913. 1912 was when Woodrow Wilson was elected. And I think you could stack a big stack of things that were harmful to federalism and harmful to individuals' freedoms under that administration. Yep. So we talk a little bit about the taxing authority, and there's so many different taxes that are imposed, different types of taxes. The one that impacts all of us so dramatically is the income tax, which of course came with the 16th Amendment we're going to talk about later. This kind of gives you a picture of what happened as the states were added, and you can see so many of the western states, most of the state doesn't have control over the land. The state had to give it back, they had to give it to the federal government as kind of a I don't know, bribe, if you will, to allow them to become a state, because Congress has control over who becomes the states. There is a quote here from James Madison. He said, "I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedoms of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpation." Now, I thought about this, and I thought, that could be kind of a distinction between socialists have the idea of the gradual, silent encroachment, and communists have the idea of violent, sudden change. Okay, so that's about the only difference. Both of them end up having the government much bigger and much more intrusive into the lives of us as individuals. So, James Madison's quote about the different types of encroachment. So, Article 2, the executive branch is limited. There's only like 6 powers that the executive branch has. We talked about last week how that the chief executive takes an oath, and in that oath he makes a pledge to faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States. Well, what is that office? To execute the laws. Okay? So I read that as, I will faithfully execute the laws of the United States. And then he says that he takes an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Okay? And it's interesting that that same oath exists in every single oath of any federal officer in our government has to take that same oath. So some of the things he is, the chief executive is the commander-in-chief of the military. He is the chief diplomat. He's the one that can work on and create treaties. Of course, the Senate has to approve them. He's also the one who can influence Congress, that is, by presenting to Congress, for example, a budget, a proposed budget. Congress actually passes the budget because they spend the money, but the executive can propose where he would like to have them concentrate efforts. He makes a presentation. Now, it doesn't always have to be something where he's speaking to Congress. This is called the State of the Union. He can write a letter to the Congress and present a State of Union by just a letter to the Congress. But traditionally now we have this speech that usually takes place somewhere along the way in the first few months of the administration where there is the State of the Union address. I don't like to call the president the chief legislator. He's kind of a partner with the with Congress in the sense that He can propose ideas of what he would like to see accomplished in his administration, what he thinks that would be appropriate legislation, but he doesn't really have the power to do anything other than to persuade. Now, he has a bully pulpit. And what does that mean? That means he can go on TV just about any time he wants to and talk to the people. And of course, the people then call their congressman and say, this is what I want, because I support what the president is saying. So that's what they're talking about when they say that he has that role. There are certain defined powers. We talked about them. Commander-in-Chief, appoint ambassadors, make treaties, present the State of the Union. Then also we have the succession of the presidency, and this, of course, has been altered by the 22nd and 25th Amendments. So our federal government has been designed with a lot of very specific limitations on what each of the branches of government can do and what they are supposed to do. There's a lot in the Constitution about the Electoral College. It has made some changes over time with regard to the method of nomination and voting of the electors, but we still have the process of each state having a specific role in sending electors to the Electoral College. If it weren't for that, it would be a situation where it's almost this way now, where populated states dominate completely the process. And if we had a popular vote, then the only place where any presidential candidate would go would be to those populated states, because if he could dominate the states like New York, New Jersey, some of those northeastern areas were highly populated, and out to the West Coast, he'd sew it up, because the popular vote is where he would be able to get so many more votes in the electoral, or in the process of being elected. So electoral votes, Electoral College allows for no state to be completely ignored.
Where is that explained in the Constitution?
Yeah, that's also in the process of the selection of the president. So that's under Article 2.
Article 2.
And then, of course, Article 3, we talked about that, the judicial power, the power of the courts. There are certain types of courts and limitations. For example, you can't just file any lawsuit in the federal court. It has to be a certain type of case. Citizens of one state against citizens of another state is about as far as it goes. For example, if you had a beef against the state of Arizona, you wouldn't necessarily be able to bring a lawsuit in federal court unless you tied it to some right protected by the federal government or federal constitution. All right, so we're going to, there's other articles. Article 4 talks about the fact that the states have to honor extradition. That is the right to one state to act, that they surrender a criminal to another, to the jurisdiction of another state where a crime was committed. The guarantee clause, that's a very important, where the Constitution guarantees to the various states a Republican form of government, which is what that means is a representative type of government, not a democracy, one where people vote directly, but rather they vote for representatives who are statesmen that then go to the Congress and deliberate and pass laws. There are certain types of other things that are discussed in the Constitution, that is the process of amending the Constitution, and then also the fact that in Article 6, the Constitution is regarded as the supreme law of the land, and then there was the process of ratifying the Constitution that's discussed in Article 7. Now we get into the next phase.
The Constitution itself is meant to protect the minority. The majority can always get their way in any society, just having more in numbers and strength and so forth. But the Constitution is formulated to protect the minority. And this is where the Electoral College comes in It protects the states with minority populations compared to high state, populations. This was necessary to the protection of a union of states. Now, obviously, always in a big group, some feel like that their worth is more than others, and they like to take advantage of that as much as they possibly can. But we still rely on each other. And so even with minority groups, the Constitution protects their voice over those who want to be dominant. So it's on every level that the minorities have a voice because of the representative government that is provided for under the Constitution. This is the checks, or one of the checks and balances that we have. This is part of the limited government that we have, where it can't assume all powers because the people have not granted all of those powers to any governing body. So it's there, and it's in a position where we can be free and we can all be represented. We just have to understand how to make sure those rights continue to flow.